Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Amanda McKendree, and I'm the Arthur F. and Mary J. O'Neill Director of the Fanning Center for Business Communication at the University of Notre Dame. I'll be serving as today's moderator. Thank you for joining us for our series, Communicating with Impact, where we've spent the past couple of weeks thinking about the topic of civil discourse, becoming a better conversation partner. Our hope is that this series will create opportunities for us to connect with one another and challenge one another as we build a virtual community with global reach. We've seen strong interest in our series so far, with over 900 individuals registered as part of our learning community. Today's discussion will include opportunities for interaction and engagement, and you will be able to ask questions during our time together today. When you have a question, please use the Google form that we are sharing with you now. This will allow us to facilitate the questions as effectively as possible, and we will try to answer as many questions that we can within our hour together. At this time, I would like to thank our co-sponsors for the series, including the Mendoza College of Business and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Several individuals from our communications team, as well as the ThinkND production staff, have contributed their time and efforts to make this series possible. And now I'd like to welcome today's guest, who will discuss incivilities and share some recent ideas from a publication titled Constant Civility as Corrosion of the Soul, Surviving Through and Beyond the Politics of Politeness. Dr. Stacey K. Sowards is a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research focuses on environmental, intercultural, and gender and communication in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the United States. Welcome, Stacey. Our series has asked a number of questions, beginning with our first topic of what business can do to promote civil discourse and reduce polarization. Our second session asks, how can we think differently about the topic of listening? Today's question might be posed as, what are the consequences of polite and/or civil discourse? Dr. Sowards, how can we begin to think about this important question?
Well, first, I want to thank everyone at Notre Dame and the Alumni Association and Dr. McKendree for having me today. It's a pleasure to be able to talk a little bit more about this subject. And I think when we're thinking about civil discourse, in the title, I'd actually put the in parentheses to signify this idea that we do want to have civil discourse, but there are also moments in which we might want to have in civil discourse. Mm-hmm. And so what I've been thinking a lot about is, I think that in our society, we have a lot of incivil discourses happening, and we can certainly talk about those. But what I'm in particular thinking about is the expectation for politeness and civil discourse in the workplace or in academia, and what that means for certain groups of people, particularly women of color, women of all colors, I guess, and then the notion of other minoritized groups who are often subjected to macroaggressions, but also microaggressions. And when do we find the moments to absorb those or speak out against those in ways that are productive for change? And so what happens is that if we are always trying to maintain a level of politeness, we can find that we absorb all of those macro and microaggressions without really ever addressing them in meaningful ways to create change. And sometimes that means it bubbles over and erupts into anger and other forms. And so I'm thinking about how we can get around these ideas of always being polite, always being kind and nice to others, because at some point those discourses get ignored or they're overlooked because they're not bringing to attention the matter at hand, those macro and microaggressions that we might experience. So then the other thing I wanted to mention, kind of and related to that, is this idea of how we do need social protest, and protest is really a form of incivil discourse, because protest is that way of bringing attention to these matters and how we draw attention. And so a lot of communication scholarship, rhetorical scholarship, which is my area of expertise, is interested in how we attract attention to different causes and different injustices. If we constantly try to engage in civil discourse, it feels like those voices aren't heard, they're ignored, and maybe the significance of those grievances isn't as significant to people who just see them as like, oh, well, they're saying something, but it doesn't sound like it's that important because the discourse is so polite and so nice. And so the moments in which we see incivil discourse arising through, say, social protest are those moments and movements that help us to move into real calls for social justice and social change. So I'll stop talking there and let you ask another question or respond to that.
Yes, so it might be helpful for us to start with some definitions. And if you could share your definition of polite discourse or civil discourse, and are those terms always interchangeable in your mind?
So I'm not sure that they're interchangeable. I think of politeness as kind of in the way that I grew up, with the expectation that there's sort of like this, I think this is true for a lot of women, but sort of this good girl narrative that, in fact, I have a 6-year-old, so I'm always telling her to be kind and nice to others. But in thinking about this talk, I'm thinking about, like, she's 6 and I want her to speak up about things that are problematic, but also it's the skill that we learn to be kind and nice to others as kids. And I think especially for little girls, we grow up learning to be kind and nice. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But then it takes on this way of being in which we don't always voice our grievances. And so I think that politeness can mean holding things in the idea of being kind and nice to others. And so politeness is definitely valued, especially from women in our society. And I think that politeness is certainly something that we should strive for in most circumstances. But I think there are moments in which we might want to violate those social expectations. And then if we contrast that to civil discourse, so civil discourse, I don't think is necessarily the same thing as politeness, about this idea of engaging in ideas, but in ways that require listening and full engagement. So it can't just be the act of speaking your mind in a nice way, but it's also about listening to the other person and or people. And it sounds like your previous session addressed some of this, but there's a concept of rhetorical listening and rhetorical silence, and the role and the value of listening and engaging in silence. And so that could certainly be a part of civil discourse. But I think where civil discourse can become problematic is when and I've been thinking a lot about this in relationship to another concept from my field called invitational rhetoric. Invitational rhetoric is this idea that we invite people to participate in discourse and offer perspectives, engage in principles of absolute listening. But at some point, there's a place in which we may have to draw the line in what civil discourse means or what invitational discourse means, because we get to a point where perhaps the violation of social justice or some kind of gendered or sexist communication or racist or anti-Black communication is taking place. And so how do we move beyond those instances that can be macro or microaggressions and still engage in civil discourse. And there's a lot of different ways that we might think about that. For example, Dr. Loretta Ross has this idea of calling in instead of calling out. And I think that that's a really interesting idea, especially in the college classroom, that we can have conversations instead of just calling people out on Twitter or social media, or even in the classroom. How can we call people in and make that an educational moment? So that's really valuable, but it only works if people are willing to engage in that listening practice. And I think that that's where we start to see the breakdown of civil discourse, is when the other party, other groups of people, participants in the discourse aren't engaging in that kind of listening and reflection and learning process. And so that's when I think incivility becomes a little more necessary, or we have to move into some kind of social protest, or even the calling out of something, because it moves past the opportunity for an educational or learning moment, because the person or people are not willing to listen.
Mm-hmm. Your article highlighted the idea of politeness being policed. Can you talk more about that concept and what that means for your work?
Yeah, I think that I would argue that this happens to women a lot, that politeness is policed, that there's this sort of expectation of what politeness is. And of course, different folks have different styles of communication. And so what might be considered polite by one person might not be considered polite for another person. And I think that that's a really important aspect of that. Usually politeness is policed around whiteness. And so the whiteness is the white gendered expectations of politeness are mainstreamed. And so I think for a lot of Black women, for example, the perception of of a Black woman being very angry means that there's always this stereotype threat there related to that anger, but also in the understanding of what that anger means and the manifestation. And so that anger can, for a lot of different folks, can erupt in ways that might seem impolite or uncivil, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the intention of that person, in part because it could be different communication styles, or it could be a difference in how someone understands a social justice issue, or a microaggression or a macroaggression. And so I think that in that way, then politeness is very much policed through whiteness and through these sort of gendered norms that we expect for women in our societies.
We have a question that just came in that connects to this idea of maybe having lines drawn at different points for different people. And this question asks, as you draw the line between civil and uncivil discourse, is that line different for men than for women? And how can you tell if you are the one doing the line drawing?
Maybe a line drawn in the sand is too strong of a word, because I think that boundary is blurry. And I think on one day you might say, that's it, this is the line that I'm drawing. And on another day you might not. But I think that I was talking to a colleague of mine who was talking about starting out in academia. This would have been maybe the late 80s, early 90s. And as the only woman in her department, she was sort of the one who was expected to host dinners for the department, host baby showers for graduate students, or do these kinds of invisible labors that men don't do or did not do in the 80s and the 90s. And so this expectation of playing the host is very gendered. And in fact, today, the New York Times had an article about why women in the workplace aren't being promoted as much. And I think that this article kind of highlighted this very notion of the polite expectation and kind of that tightrope that we're always balancing on. That, you know, if you call something out or if you bring something to somebody's attention, it can be very much seen as calling out in a way that's not considered appropriate. So there's sort of these norms of appropriate and inappropriateness. And again, that plays out on racial lines, right? So the expectation that Asian and Asian American women, particularly East Asian and East Asian Americans, are expected to be not just polite, but almost silent. That's the stereotype and social expectation. And so when we hear Asian American women speaking out against some injustice, it can be seen as a violation of social norms and social expectations because of those stereotypes. And so I think that if we go back to this idea of the line in the sand, again, sometimes I think it kind of depends on how egregious the issue is and your mood of that day. And I think it depends on those things because it is this constant corrosion, as I talk about in this article that Dr. McKendree mentioned, that, you know, some days you're fine. You're like, I'm in a good mood and everything's good. And then, but it's that constant corrosion where you're like, it's building up. And then one day you're like, I've had enough. I can't take it. And that's sort of the moment when you might violate the social norms of politeness and civil discourse. That the anger can erupt in those kinds of ways that might be productive or might not be, because of these kind of social expectations of politeness and civilness.
Another term that comes to mind, and you've highlighted this in your comments, is the idea of emotional labor. Can you discuss that concept a little bit more for us, and specifically what it means for the politics of politeness?
Yes, the emotional labor. Some colleagues of mine just had a forum published in, I'm forgetting the name of the journal, but it was about what's called the second shift. So many of us who study gender or feminist theories will understand the second shift as the labor that women have been expected to do from the workplace and then going home and taking care of the children and making dinner and taking care of a partner or a spouse and the laundry and all of the things that happen at home. A third shift might be considered educational advancement on top of all of that. So, you know, after the kids go to bed, the mom is taking classes at night. But what Devika Chawla, my colleague at the Ohio University, argues is that the second shift can also be this emotional labor, the invisible labor that goes into diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so this is this idea that, DEI issues are very important to me. I do a lot of work in race, ethnicity, gender, environment. I'm the chair of our department's DEI committee. And I think what that means for me is that I'm constantly thinking about these issues. And so I bring them home. And because they're not just issues in my workplace, but they're bigger societal issues that reflect really deep-seated social injustice throughout our societies, there's just sort of this constant thinking about that and how people of color and other marginalized groups in our society have been treated and what that means for them in my workplace or any workplace, and then in educational settings and legal settings and all of the different ways in which those can manifest. And so there's just this constant corrosion of always thinking about these social injustices that can really be damaging in that sense for someone who, I think we should all be thinking about them, but I think that certain groups in our society experience those issues much more so than others. And because of that, they're constantly thinking about that. And as, for example, with microaggressions, a microaggression might not be so bad if it happens one time or once a year, or even maybe once a month. But when it happens on a daily basis, it's just that thing that eats you up, and you're thinking about it all the time. Not just because of what's happened to you in the past, but you're constantly on guard for how you might interact with people in any kind of situation. Like, oh, is this person going to make a microaggression when I talk to them again? Or I don't know this person. I don't know what they're going to say. And so constantly being on guard is part of that emotional labor, or the second shift, or the constant corrosion of our souls, as I say in the article that Dr. McKendree read.
And I wanted to just point to one of the quotes from your article that I was thinking about as I was listening to your response. Politeness then can become a stifling coffin in which one physically survives, but emotionally does not, as a result of the invisible labor, the emotional labor that goes into always trying to manage those expectations.
Yeah, so I think this stifling coffin notion, I'm talking about a novel that I read in quoting the author. The main character is a Jamaican immigrant, and so she thinks by coming here to the US, to New York City, that she's going to make it. And when she gets here, it's just like all of these constant abuses and ways in which she's mistreated, or like loses her job and then can't find a new job, all of the things that can happen to undocumented immigrants in our country, and other folks as well. And so it just, like, she thinks she's made it because she's gotten to the US, but then it becomes this kind of stifling coffin because she can't really get out of it and doesn't know how to get out of it. And I think that's a more severe form of discrimination and class standing than most of us in academia face. But I think what it means for us in academia is more this idea that I think that many of us are experiencing with pandemic burnout, for example. Like, this just, it's never going to end. And are we ever going to go back to life as it was? And do we want to? But sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. So I think that so many people are experiencing that kind of burnout because of the pandemic, but we can also be experiencing burnout because of microaggressions and other forms of kind of this maintenance of politeness and civil discourse all the time.
We have a question that's come in that is encouraging us to think about, so what can we do, and what can we do to facilitate change? And specifically, the question states, what is the most effective way to break from politeness to address discourse and facilitate change? Can you expand on calling in instead of calling out?
Sure. I want to say that calling in is not a concept that I came up with, but it's Loretta Ross's, and she's at Smith College. I just opened that article this morning, so I'll paste the link to the article in the chat box. Let me do that real quick. I think it'll go to, it just goes to the hosts and the panelists, but
we can make sure that the link is shared. We can post it on our follow-up resource page.
Yeah. So what Dr. Ross argues is that we should, so calling out, as we know, can be things like calling people out on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, or I guess TikTok. I'm not as great with social media, but there are these ways in which we call people out in those platforms. And then also that we could do that in the classroom, we can do that with our colleagues. But a lot of times what happens when we call people out, especially in interpersonal situations or within the workplace, is that people get defensive. And so in those moments, then we might find that the thing that we're trying to address is not actually addressed because people retreat into defensiveness. And I think most people have the intention of being non-sexist and non-racist and non-discriminatory. And of course, that's not what happens in reality, because we all have biases. But the issue with calling out is that it doesn't really change behaviors. So what Dr. Ross argues is that we should call people in, and that could be things like saying, well, what do you mean by that? Or can you say more about what you're thinking? And then trying to have a civil or polite discussion. So it has the effect of not letting it go, but still kind of maintaining the civil discourse of addressing them. Usually it's a microaggression. And I suppose you could use it for a macroaggression too. I'm not sure how that would work. But I think that trying to bring attention to those microaggressions can be helpful, and in such a way that can maintain that level of civil discourse.
What about recommendations for calling someone into conversation around timely topics, vaccinations or guns or abortion or similar polarizing issues? It seems people are so primed for an argument that I'm curious how we could possibly create the conditions for dialogue.
I think civil discourse only works when all of the parties are willing to listen and engage in perspective exchange. And so that's one of the reasons why we get to the place of in civil discourse or protest, or I guess where we are now, because it seems like we have, and I don't know what to say about this, because I don't know how we bridge those gaps. To me, I'll just say that I'm very pro-vaccine and pro-mask wearing. And so it's hard, because I think that the anti-vax folks and the anti-mask folks are wrong. And not only do I think that they're wrong, I think that they're continuing and perpetuating the situation that we're in, and perpetuating this public health pandemic that we're in. So how do we talk about that? So I think the first thing I would say is that some of those folks are not willing to listen, and some of those folks are. I know that Sanjay Gupta, for example, went on, can't remember the guy's name, but one of the conservative anti-vaxxer talk show hosts. And he talked to that guy for about 3 hours about the importance of vaccines. So I think that that's an example of civil discourse. But then what Sanjay Gupta, if you don't know Sanjay Gupta, he's a CNN reporter who's also a medical doctor and has worked a lot on reporting on the pandemic for CNN. Thank you, Joe Rogan. I forgot the guy's name because I don't listen to Joe Rogan, but I think that that's a really interesting example. And what Sanjay Gupta said is that maybe he didn't change Joe Rogan's mind, but he did get Joe Rogan to admit that he had considered getting vaccinated. And then if Dr. Gupta had changed any of his listeners' minds, he said that it would be worth it. And so there are moments that we might be able to have those kinds of conversations, but then again, is it worth 3 hours of Dr. Gupta's time to engage in that? For Dr. Gupta, yes. I don't know that we all want to engage in that kind of discourse for like that kind of extended period of time without reaching some kind of resolution. So I think it's very challenging right now to talk about those kinds of issues, guns and vaccines. And I used to live in El Paso, Texas, and this was the time of the El Paso Walmart shooting about, I guess it was 2 years ago. And, a lot of people in El Paso aren't interested in owning guns, and yet the state of Texas has passed so much pro-gun ownership kinds of legislations. And so I'm not sure how we have those kinds of conversations when people aren't willing to listen to each other. And I think that that's why we start to see the incivilities and the social protest emerging from those kinds of discussions.
We talked a bit about the idea of being uncomfortable in our last session with listening and being willing to recognize that those moments can be uncomfortable. What would you suggest about trying to identify those moments within the workplace that might seem uncomfortable, but are necessary for navigating a difficult conversation or topic?
So I think in the context of race and gender, it's about being able to be to sit with the discomfort of being called out, and being willing to consider that you're wrong, or that you're racist, or that you're sexist, or that you're ableist, or that you're whatever. And that is very, very uncomfortable for most people. But I think if we can consider the ways in which we do have those biases, and the ways in which we say things that we need to rethink, or that we might want to consider, those are places in which I'm not saying that we should be comfortable with that, but instead of being defensive about being called out, I think what we really have to do is consider the possibility that the other person is right, and that can be very uncomfortable. So I think we have to sit with that discomfort, and instead of being defensive, we have to reflect and do the work to figure out what it is that we can do, and how we can communicate with people in better ways, and not engage in microaggressions.
We have a question that just came in about the real goal of discourse around vaccines in particular. When would the goal be to convert the other person? Don't we need to enter the discourse with an expectation to listen and learn rather than to convert?
Yes. So normally I would say, yes, we should just listen and learn and value the other person's perspective. Like I just said, right? We can't just be defensive and insist that we're right. So I think we can say that about issues related to race and gender and ability and nationality and citizenship. And it's important for us to sit with that discomfort. So I think that, with people who are anti-vaccine or anti-masks, that gets a little bit harder because there is scientific evidence, medical evidence, research that supports vaccines and mask wearing. But then I think we have to look for the cracks and the places in which we might consider perspectives. So there might be folks who have very legitimate reasons for concern, right? That vaccines have been proven to work. So let me just put that out there. But people might be skeptical, or they want to wait and see what happens. So there are still folks like that who haven't been vaccinated. I think that number is definitely dwindling. But they want to see and know more about the vaccine itself. And that, given the historical contexts of like the Tuskegee Institute, and how Black men were treated for, or not treated, I should say, for syphilis, if I'm remembering the case correctly, there's that place in which some communities of color have a deep mistrust of science and medicine, and see those fields as white dominated, and potentially out to get people. And so, I think that those concerns are things that we should listen to and try to understand where people are coming from. So people have different reasons for not getting vaccines. And some of those are about conspiracy theories that we're seeing flying around on social media. And, some of the reasons why social media companies need to address those mistruths. So I think it's very complicated, but if we can try to listen to the places in which people do have legitimate concerns, and maybe the goal isn't to convert somebody in their opinion to get a vaccine, but it's to get them to have a conversation about it, because sometimes people work through those issues by talking about what their concerns are and then can kind of see what it is that they're actually thinking. I know earlier on, part of the concern was, if you think about how vaccines work, you get the first one, and then you have to get a second one 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, unless it's the Johnson & Johnson one. But people are actually concerned because they know that they're going to get sick from the vaccine, right? So I know when I got my second one, I wasn't feeling so well for a day or so. And I know people who were sick for like a week. And so not everybody has the time to manage the second vaccine, or sometimes in the case of the first vaccine, people became sicker than others, right? And so there are more complicated reasons for not getting the vaccine than just being opposed to the vaccine. And I think if we can kind of listen to those and try to understand where people are coming from, that helps us to engage in civil discourse if that's where we want to go. Because on the other hand, sometimes that, just shouting at somebody to get a vaccine isn't going to work either.
We have several participants who've been joining the series in parts 1 and part 2, and today they're returning to workplaces. They're thinking about how do we engage with each other in new and different ways when you haven't done that in, say, 18 months or so. And if we look to politeness as a way to handle that, you write that it actually prevents us from fully participating in diverse workplaces, organizations, and other settings. What would you recommend as a way to work through this challenge as people are returning to in-person interactions in the workplace?
One of the things I've noticed about myself is that I've been so excited to see people that I've just been talking and talking and talking. And I just started at UT in last fall. So I'm actually just meeting most of my colleagues for the first time face to face. And I don't know. I mean, I think as we return to the office, again, trying to think about ways in which we can have civil discourses and not be defensive, but also recognizing opportunities to listen and engage with people in meaningful ways. I think that we are engaging in more meaningful conversations when we have connections with people. And so I think that that's really valuable. If you feel like you have a connection with somebody, that's super helpful. Like, I think that there's a lot of trolling that happens in social media and on the internet that might not happen in face-to-face settings, because of people do attach their names to comments that they make online, but it doesn't have the same effect as it if you were to say those kinds of things in a face-to-face setting. So I think that remembering that the face-to-face piece is really helpful and valuable in building connections. And sometimes we want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And again, I think that all of these scenarios are situational and contextual. And, sometimes we might be willing to do the work. And sometimes we want to consider how much time we're willing to give some of these subjects too. Like, sometimes it's just easier to be polite and move on. And sometimes we do really want to engage with somebody on an issue.
And related to that, we just had a comment posted for us detailing that ideas change over time as new information is added, new content is added. And that's speaking to the context that you just mentioned, and how do we navigate that new information and the changing information as it unfolds?
Yeah, I think that that's really great. I'm looking at the chat right now about how the conversation has changed. That's so important, right? Because even today, conversations about race and gender have changed. And so, I'm thinking about, like, conversations or the use of the singular they, that's something that's relatively new. And the labels that we use for folks, right? Latinx, for example, or Latine instead of Latino or Hispanic. We've seen kind of a shift moving away from African American to Black Americans or Black folks. And so these conversations have evolved and have changed, and the terms are changing. And I think that that's the really cool and great thing about communication, is that it's constantly evolving, and that these identity labels, if we want to use those as an example, are a way to achieve more inclusivity or more, I don't want to say accurate, but labels that people feel describe them in better ways. And so these are really important parts of how conversations change and how contexts and situations change. And to go back to, say, Joe Rogan, for example, I'm not willing to engage in a 3-hour conversation with somebody like that, but I might be willing to do a conversation. I might be willing to engage him for 5 minutes. But I don't want to spend 3 hours of my time engaging him. But I might be more willing to engage somebody for 3 hours if I felt like they were receptive and maybe not so entrenched in their own perspective. And by engagement, I mean, having a conversation, having a discussion about something. It's a blurry line, to be sure.
Do you have any advice or recommendations for how we can begin those conversations? What have you found as helpful starting points?
I would say, again, to go back to my point about not being defensive. And I think also it's really important to value our educations, but I don't just mean sort of the canonical ways in which we understand education, but to really expand what we know about the world. And by that, it could mean listening to podcasts from perspectives that you might not normally listen to, or to read books about people you might not normally, authors or people you might not normally read about, even watching a television show or a movie. So just maybe trying to expand our perspectives by looking for those sources that we might not normally consider. Mm-hmm. And that's tricky because I think that there are certain ways in which misinformation can be spread in that way. And so how do we find the sources that reflect authenticity? In some ways, authenticity might not be the right word, but I'm trying to think about how if you're reading a novel, obviously that's not a true story, but what can that teach us about the world and folks in the world? But then also we have to recognize that it's one representation, and so there's a lot of work to be done. But I think that when we try to bridge our knowledge gaps with all of the things that are out there in the world, I mean, we have access to so many things, and we have all of these opportunities to expand our minds and to keep growing and learning.
So these examples of bridging knowledge gaps and expanding our perspectives, would you say that those are helpful strategies that address one of the central questions from your piece that you posed? How do we unlearn politeness and civility?
I don't know about that. I don't know how we unlearn that. Mm-hmm. Because it's that sort of thing where in academia, for example, you're taught to be a good colleague, and that collegiality is this really important value. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be collegial, but where are those places where we kind of move from I've just had enough of the microaggression, or I've had enough of the incivility. So I think that is so hard. And I don't know the answer, right? Because it's so ingrained in who I am. And so, I don't know how we get there, but I think it's something that just by considering that question, that we might want to unlearn politeness. Or maybe what it is about is making more conscious choices in being polite. Like, is this the moment that I want to continue being polite and collegial and kind and nice? Or do I want to maybe break away from that for a minute? Mm-hmm. Because it does have consequences, and those happen along gender and race lines for sure, right? Like if people are stereotyped into certain roles and you violate those expectations, then that can have consequences, some good, some bad.
Mm-hmm. And the point in your article, you were discussing there are going to be situations that seem to require politeness, and that might be your first impulse to respond in that way, but yet it really demands anger. And maybe that's the moment that you're talking about, that at least you're more conscious of, I'm responding in this way, but maybe I'm responding in a different way. That might be a little bit more uncomfortable than what I'm used to.
Yeah. Well, if you think about lawyers in a courtroom, they're expected to maintain a certain decorum of, maybe politeness isn't quite the right word, but there's a decorum, right? And when lawyers or witnesses or defendants violate that, then they can be held in contempt, and the judge has a lot of power in maintaining that decorum. And so, I think it's really complicated to think about when we might violate those moments of decorum. And like I said, because it does have consequences, if you call somebody out for sexism or racism or ableism, and that person retreats into defensiveness, it affects the relationship that you have going forward with that person. And so, you have to consider if that's something you really want to do, and being conscious of that choice, I think, is really helpful. Because sometimes you're like, I'm going to consciously choose to respond in this polite or civil way because I want this relationship to continue in certain kinds of ways. And maybe sometimes you choose to be incivil because you may not want to maintain a relationship with that person, or that the relationship that you have with that person it's too toxic to be meaningful. And so, or sometimes people can take it, right? Like, I think that some people are engaged. I'm a former debater, and so debaters can be very aggressive in their communication styles. And I think that that's a different form of communication. And so some people are more willing to engage in that style of communication. And so it's really contextual and situational.
Let's think for a moment about the use of the word aggressive there in the shift from civil or polite discourse into something what one of our participants is referring to as more aggressive. And how do you control the spin up in aggression by both sides when the consequences of this could be devastating?
Yeah, that's really hard. I don't know. It's I don't have a good answer other than to say that aggression ramps up when people feel like they're not being listened to. Mm-hmm. And so again, if we go back to this idea of listening and silence and trying to sit with that, it can be very helpful for civil discourse. But again, people on all of the sides have to be willing to do that. And it can be very racialized and gendered. And so I don't know how we deal with that kind of aggression. I mean, I've had plenty of these sorts of arguments with my father. And I think we both come to a place where we're like, okay, certain subjects are okay to talk about and certain subjects are not, because we just get too ramped up. And so I won't talk to him about certain issues because I know what his position is, and I've heard it many times, and I'm like, okay, I just don't agree with that. So we kind of don't talk about it. But does that help either of us move forward? I'm not sure. But it does mean that we don't get aggressive with each other. And then what happens in social protest is another matter, right? Like I think in a social protest, we already know that there's not going to be listening happening because it's a protest. And I think once you move into the place of protest, you've already decided that you're drawing the line in the sand, and like that you're at the protest because whatever the thing you're protesting against is not acceptable to you. And anybody who's at that protest on the other side, they're on the other side, and they're there because they already think that they're right too. So that's probably not the place for listening to happen. And when we talk about incivilities, of course, I'm not saying that we should engage in violence, but sometimes that violence happens because people are so adamant about being right. And I don't know the answer to that.
One other question that just came in here, and it connects back to the question of unlearning politeness, and maybe that shouldn't be the ultimate goal, because it could be perhaps code for not being honest. How do you think about the idea of being honesty and kindness related to the concept of unlearning politeness?
That's a great question. I think that honesty is sometimes coded through this idea of direct or assertive communication. And so I think there are different ways to say the same thing. And we don't always say everything that we're thinking. So even if we think that, there are ways to be kind and honest at the same time. And there are ways to be honest and hurtful. And so I think that we're trying to understand honesty in the way that we want to communicate that honesty. And sometimes that honesty is communicated in a way that is not kind or civil. But there are other ways of communicating the same thing. And it can be a very difficult conversation to find that place of kindness or politeness. But to say that, I guess when I say unlearning politeness, I think it goes again back to that idea of the conscious choice, right? That we're making a conscious choice to be kind and nice and polite. And something I've been thinking a lot about is there's a lot of people in the world, and then there are people that are just not good people. And so I don't really know too many people like that, but I know that they're out there in the world, like people who engage in human trafficking or drug cartels. And so there are folks out there that we don't want to be kind and nice to, but if you were to encounter them on the street, you probably wouldn't know those things about them. And but we know those kinds of people are out there, and maybe we don't want to engage in discourse with criminals, for example. I don't know. It's complicated because our judicial system and incarceration systems are also very racialized.
As we think about coming up on the close of our time together here, are there 3 particular key takeaways that you'd like to share with our participants?
I guess I'll go back to this idea of the conscious choice to think about when we're civil and when we might want to move beyond that. That's contextual and situational. So the question asker who brought that up is a really great point. And that we want to think about the times when we can sit with discomfort of being called out, or when somebody else might actually be right, and to consider those perspectives more fully than we might if we remain entrenched in our own way of thinking. And I think that that's how we learn more about the world. And then lastly, I would just say to remember that the way in which politeness is expected from certain groups in our society and the expectation of civility, when we continue to expect civility and politeness from marginalized groups, it means that we're not hearing everything that they have to say, or that we're not, as a society, taking those as seriously as we probably should. And so that's where we see anger or protest emerging, because people feel like they're not being heard. And so how can we situate those people more into places of being heard? And how do we give voice to folks who feel like they're coming from marginal places and aren't being heard? How do we address those social injustices that we see in the world?
Stacey, thank you so much for challenging the ways that we've been thinking about civil discourse in this series, bringing in your knowledge and of the importance of understanding microaggressions, macroaggressions, the influence of emotional labor on our interactions. I think we've all learned some of these helpful strategies that we can take into professional settings and personal settings in ways that will allow us to become better conversation partners for one another. Thanks to all of our participants who joined us today and who've been with us through our 3-part series. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.